Making 2 quiches, and I'm also going to be bulk making some pie crust. We have a lot of vegetables ready to harvest that I want to start eating up in the garden. Also, my chickens are producing like crazy. We are getting so many eggs, I don't even know what to do with it. On top of that, our dishwasher has just broken. Having quiches already pre-made, ready to enjoy in the mornings with less dishes is the perfect thing for a busy mommy. With all that said, let's get out to the garden and get to harvesting. It has been so hot outside and our garden is producing like crazy. I'm really excited for the next garden tour video because we have made so many improvements to the garden. First, I'm going to harvest some of our spoon tomatoes and then some grape tomatoes, as well as I'm thinking some basil and kale for this quiche. One of my favorite things on this planet, basil. I wish you guys could smell that. I'm here next to my kale. I've had this kale for like 2 years or so, and I'm ready to get rid of this one and start new kale bushes. So I'm in the process of starting new kale. Once those have started to sprout and I can harvest off of them, I'm gonna say goodbye to this kale, probably give it to the chickens. All right, I have what I need inside. I actually already have like tons of grape tomatoes, so I'm just gonna use those down. Let's get to baking. Oh my goodness, guys, it is so hot out there. I know I keep saying that over and over again. I'm trying to spend as little time as possible out in the sun when it's like high noon, but sometimes that's just the only time that you got. I'm happy to be inside, so thankful for air conditioning. Unlike my dishwasher that's broken, my AC is not broken right now. Thank the Lord. Got my apron on. This is one of the aprons that my grandma sewed for me. She actually has an Etsy account, and I'll include it in the description below if you guys want to check that out. She is super, super talented when it comes to making like quilts and literally anything you can think of. She's so talented. So, got my apron on that she made me. I need to start cleaning these vegetables. The kale now has tons of aphids on it, just that time of the year. The good news is kale is super resilient to aphids, but I gotta make sure I wash those off very thoroughly. I like to wash them in vinegar to make sure we're killing all those bacteria and things like that. Let's wash those. I just wanted to show you guys our tomato harvest. This is literally just from like one day. And if you can imagine, I actually put about a pound of San Marzano tomatoes, which are ideal for canning, in the freezer yesterday too. So yesterday was a good tomato harvest. We're starting to get some beef steaks, which is really exciting. Lots of BLTs coming up in the future. I just love making some awesome sandwiches with our beefsteak tomatoes. And that's why I'm just gonna be using some of these grape tomatoes in the quiche recipe today. So I have made a lot of pie crust in my day. I actually was a professional pastry chef. I am classically trained. I went to culinary school for pastry and baking, and I've been just obsessed with making pies ever since I was like 8 years old. I've tested out a lot of different pie crust recipes, a lot of trial and error, of course, and I found that the perfect pie crust recipe is half parts shortening and then half parts butter. A lot of people either want to use an all butter crust or all shortening. It's kind of like a one or the other, but I have found that if you do half part shortening, half part butter, you get that super flaky crust that you would attain with the shortening, and then you also get that super tasty buttery flavor that you would get with the butter. I swear it is the best pie crust combination I have tried so far. If you have a good pie crust recipe that you swear by, definitely leave it in the comment section below. So for today's recipe, I'm just doubling it. I'm hoping to have enough left over for a whole pie or 2 pies that just require 1 crust. The quiches only need 1 crust per pie, so I should definitely have some left over. I'm going to freeze the crust that we're not using today. A lot of people don't realize just how well pie crust freezes. It is a really really great option, especially close to the holidays when you don't want to worry about making pie crust and you do insist on making your pies with crust from scratch like me. It's just one less thing to worry about. So as the holidays approach closer, I will definitely make a bulk pie crust video. That way you can see how I do that and how I freeze my crust. Now it is time to make our pie crust. Another key part to this recipe, which some of y'all might think like she's crazy, is to melt the butter ahead of time. Yes, I said melt all the way into liquid. This will make it so that we have like 1,000 more little tiny butter granules than you would if you were to do the whole like frozen and cutting it in type thing. I'll show you. For me, making pie crust is so relaxing. So you just need to add your flour to a bowl, then your sugar and your salt, and mix together. Melt your butter and gently pour it into the flour mix. I use a fork to start fluffing it up and creating those butter balls. Once the butter is mostly mixed, I use my hand to further distribute the butter balls. Then I cut in the shortening and I add water. So for this recipe, I'll need at least half a cup for one recipe or 1 cup for the double recipe. But with that said, it really depends on the altitude that you live in or just the amount of flour that you might have put in like your cup measuring spoon. Sometimes you'll need more water, sometimes you'll need less water. So it's definitely something that you need to feel out based on like the texture and the moisture level of the pie crust. So I'm just gonna cut in a cup of shortening into there. Usually I do all of my pie crust by hand and I don't use a mixer, but if I'm making such a big recipe, I will use a mixer just out of convenience. We're ready to mix very lightly. You definitely don't want to overmix pie crust, and if you're using a mixer, there's a higher chance that's going to happen. So just gently pulse it until everything starts to come together. I like to pour a little bit of the water, mix, and see if it needs any more after that. We're ultimately looking for a non-stick type of texture. You don't want the flour to be wet enough where it's sticking to your fingers. The pie crust is done. I personally enjoy working with pie crust that's more hydrated. Some people like more crumbly crust, but for me, I like the more hydrated crust. You can always add more flour as you're rolling it out. I can already tell that this is going to be a really good crust. I didn't need all of the water that I thought I would need, so that's why it's really important to gradually add water. I'm going to chop up my ham. I have about a half a pound of ham. That was in my freezer. I needed to use it. I'm going to use a whole sweet onion. I really do prefer using sweet onions most of the time, but especially for something like a quiche. Also going to be sauteing my kale. So we're going to put all of those together. I'm going to saute it, cook it down a little bit before it goes into the quiche mix. This ham was already sliced, so it's just going to make my life even easier to cut it into the little pieces that I want. I'm not washing off the cutting board in between because all of this is going together. It was about 2 cups or so of ham chopped, or half a pound. It really is like whatever you prefer, like what you could go more or less when it comes to quiches. The most important part with a quiche is following the recipe for the custard. Next, I'm going to be chopping up the kale. I think it's really important to remove the ribs from the kale. That way you don't have that really rough texture. That texture is really hard to cook down, and especially if you're using kale for something as delicate as quiche, I would definitely remove these ribs. I'll show you how I do that. I love cooking with things from my garden. It's like one of those full circle moments. All that hard work and effort is just paying off, and it's such a great feeling. We have put so much effort into our garden this year, and it's just really cool to finally be able to go out there and, you know, get our eggs and our vegetables and everything and be able to have full meals from things that has come from our property. We have spent so many weekends working on this garden, like sun up, rushing through the heat and everything to make sure that we're kind of building the life that we've envisioned. Every time I cook with my vegetables, I definitely don't take it for granted. When it comes to cheese for recipes, I always prefer to shred it myself. It's just a little bit of extra work, but basically when you're buying cheese that's already pre-shredded, there's a lot of different additives added in there to prevent the cheese from clumping. So it adds thickeners and things like that that I don't really want in my recipes. So I think it's best to just pre-shred it, personally. I'm using a block of a Swiss cheese for this recipe because it's going to be for 2 quiches. I think ham, Swiss goes together perfectly, but use whatever you have on hand. I'm going to get the vegetables and ham sauteing. I'm just sauteing the onions, the kale, and the ham right now. I'm not going to add the tomatoes to that, but I'm going to get that going and start the custard. Then I'm going to roll out the actual crust. The general rule of thumb when you're making a quiche is not to fill it with more than 2 cups of filling. Whatever filling that you decide, make sure that you're keeping it within that range because you can overfill the quiche and make it so that it doesn't cook properly. I always recommend cooking your meat and vegetables ahead of time. The filling is done. I sauteed it for about 15 minutes on medium to high heat and everything really cooked down, which is great. I wanted to make sure there wasn't a lot of moisture in there. That's something to really keep in mind when you're making quiches. You don't want a lot of moisture to mess with the whole egg custard. But I ended up adding some salt. I wanted to wait until the ham was cooked to see how salty the ham was because you never know with ham. I added about a teaspoon of ground garlic powder and some pepper too. Now I'm just going to have it set aside while it cools down. I'm going to whip up the custard and roll out the dough. I already have a bunch of eggs, but I want to see if my girls have laid any more before getting started. It looks like there is one egg ready to take. I need to clean out this chicken coop, so I'm gonna make another video on how I clean out this coop because it is a mess. We also have 8 baby chicks. Well, they're not so much babies anymore, that are about ready to move into here, so I want to get it all nice and pretty so that they can enjoy their new life in the big coop. I'm using 10 eggs for this recipe just because it is for 2 quiches. So again, I will put the recipe ingredients in the description for the single, and you can choose to double it, do what you want. But anyways, I'm going to be using whole milk only just because I don't have cream. So that's something to keep in mind. It doesn't have to be, you know, half cream, half whole milk. If that's what you don't have, just use what you have on hand. So I'm using some really good organic whole milk, the Swiss cheese. We'll need 5 eggs per quiche, so I'm adding 10 to the bowl because I'm doubling it. Then I'm adding my cream or milk and then my seasonings. I'd have to say a quiche done right is one of my favorite breakfast foods. So delicate, so tasty. I'm using an emulsifier to whisk this together if you don't have one. Just a regular whisk will work, but I definitely recommend getting one of these. They're so awesome for like soups, pureeing, and anything like that. I got this one from Williams-Sonoma. It is called All Clad. So anyways, it works really well. Then we're just gonna mix the egg filling till thoroughly combined. All right, we have the pie crust. I have had it chilling this whole time. I would definitely recommend chilling it for like 2 hours if you have the time at least. So like I said before, I did a double recipe. So this is definitely more than what I need, but we're going to be saving the other pie crust and freezing it. So I'm just gonna start out by separating it into 4 parts. So just get, you know, your 1 ball, cut it once down the middle, and then cut it again for your 4 even pie crust. After I evenly portion out my dough, I place it in a freezer-safe Ziploc bag. Then I actually smush it down as flat as possible. You don't want a bunch of little like bocce balls in your freezer. It just makes it more ideal for storing larger amounts of dough. Since there's actual real butter melted into this, definitely refrigerate the dough for at least 2 hours before working with it. And once you start rolling it out, make sure you're not overworking it because you don't want that butter to start melting on you. Roll your dough about 1/4 inch thick and then place it in a 9-inch pie pan. To make the pie crust pretty, I cut off the edges, the excess edges, and then I fold what's left on the top inside of itself. Once you have a nice thick rim on the top, use your finger to make those pretty little ruffles. For this quiche recipe, I actually don't pre-bake the pie crust and it turns out perfect. It's time to fill up both of these quiches and put them in the oven. I'm just gonna film the one quiche and let you guys know what that looks like. My favorite part, time to fill the quiche. So I just added the filling first and then I added the cheese, then the tomatoes. Next, I doled out about a cup and a half of the meat and vegetable mix, and I garnished with some lovely fresh basil. I was careful to toss my spoon tomatoes on top for an extra added garnish and flavor, and then I added some extra cheese. I have both quiches prepared and ready to go in the oven. Sorry, my son's in the background. It's gonna be 350 degrees for 45 to 55 minutes. I highly recommend whenever baking quiche to place them on a sheet pan. This keeps your oven clean, preventing any spills. Since the quiche is gonna be in there for a long time, you want to protect the crust. Make yourself a little foil ring and wrap it around the crust. The crust will burn if not covered. Place in the oven. You'll know it's done when it's no longer jiggly and a little bit puffy. The quiches are out of the oven and they turned out beautifully. What an amazing feeling to have a garden fresh quiche made right at home. We're all done with the quiches. It is so awesome to have breakfast done for the next few days. If you enjoy this video, please be sure to give it a like. Thanks so much for watching.